for the 25th year celebrations of GCT's founding or something like that. I don't know whether it was 1970 or 1975. There was a souvenir published for that occasion, and articles were invited, and I was invited to write an article, and I wrote. Unfortunately, I don't easily find a copy of that article. I recently looked for it, could find it. And that is a great journalistic story. And I was telling you that story. I didn't do great service to the story. I did what I could in the short time I had available. I was sitting in Bombay. But you guys are here and you can get to a better job of the story. The story is about a man who was born, I shouldn't say he was born, his grandparents' home was in Tudelu.
Okay, sir.
Both the grandparents lived in Tudelu for some time or the other. No, one grandparent lived in Tudelu. He was a railway engineer. So he must have been around the railway quarters in Tudelu. And the other was an IAS officer. And he was a collector in the Nilgiris and various other places. And they were posted in Parvatipuram in Andhra when the child was conceived. And the story is about our hero of the story. And the hero was conceived in Parvatipuram. And the grandparents had been both in India, in Indian service, IAS and ICS and railways and all that for a long time. But they're actually English citizens, British citizens. One was John Turing, the father of the boy, and the maternal father, I think, I don't remember who was father of John Turing, but he had a background in India. But the mother's father was the railway engineer, who was a bit of an inventor, and he was the one who lived in Tudelu. And being an ICS officer's wife, she went out to London to give birth to the child. There was an earlier child, an elder brother, who was already born. And she took that child. I don't know whether she took that child or whether that child had been left in London in the care of somebody. The ICS salaries were big enough that they could pay somebody to take care of their children, and that to a good family in London. And they went to, she went to London, had the child, and spent 1 year or 1.5 years with the child. Then left the second child, both the children, in the care of this foster family. And she traveled back, because in those days, an ICS officer's wife had great responsibilities. It is not just the husband who carried the job. You have to entertain the governor, you have to entertain every Englishman who came this side, and you had to represent the great English empire, British empire here and all that. So, Madame came prepared to do her onerous tasks here. And children were too much in the way, so they left the children behind. And the child grew, a rather lonely child, and you can imagine a child growing up in a foster home in a highly disciplined England. And the child became Alan M. Turing, Alan Matheson Turing. And why is he our hero? In a sense, he changed the last 60 years of our lives. He surely changed my life, and he surely changed the lives of many of you, whoever is in the computer field. And he, in a sense, is the man who really defined what is software. He invented this universal Turing machine, which is a mathematical notion, which says a machine with some basic capabilities, give it a little bit of ability to add, multiply, and test if something is zero or not, and to take a decision. If it is zero, do these things, and if it is not zero, do these things. To branch on a flow chart. Give it these abilities, a little control unit, and a tape on which you can write a large amount of data, you give it that, that is all you need. There is no other computer. Anything any computer can ever do, this little machine will do. Mathematically, the concept of computing, the most complicated things, is all there within this little concept. And he defined this concept, the universal Turing machine. And what was on the tape is essentially what we call software. What we call hardware is the little control unit and the reading head, which moved the tape left and right. And so he invented that. And he was a mathematician. So he thought about, very peculiar, mathematics has some very strange ways of reasoning. We do all kinds of reasoning. You know, if A is true, B must be true. B is true, then C must be true. Therefore, if A is true, C must be true. We do all that. But there are some very peculiar, absurd jumps, if I may call them that. To an engineer, they sound a bit absurd. That is, to show that square root of 2 can never be written as m divided by n, where m and n are integer numbers. How do you prove that? Do any of you remember the proof? Why square root of 2 cannot be a rational number? A rational number is an integer divided by another integer. It cannot be. Why? It's not very easy for an engineer to prove it. Somehow we are not trained to think like that. It is a non-constructive proof. It is a very peculiar, absurd kind of proof, which says, you know, suppose you have to do that. I can show it leads to an absurd conclusion, and therefore it cannot be true. Reductio ad absurdum. Now, Alan Turing used some brilliant, simple logic like that to show there are things that no computer can ever solve. And this is a big jump. It is one thing to think of more and more complicated machines, you will do more and more complicated things, which is what I like to do as an engineer. But here is the crazy man going around saying what computers cannot do, because if they did that, then some absurdity arises out of that. So partly he did a great thing by understanding the mathematical foundations of computing and by defining essentially what is software and truly understanding the spirit of stored program computers. Computers in which the real complexity of what you do is all in a piece of software, in the memory, and the control unit is fairly simple. And having done all this, as if this is not enough, he went and did the next thing, which was probably the most important. I really believe the man went and won the Second World War. Many of us think that the atom bomb was invented and everyone was happy ever after. That's rubbish. And what really happened was, Lord Mountbatten was the viceroy in Delhi. Have you folks read this story?
No, sir.
None of you have read this story? Mountbatten was viceroy in Delhi in 1942. On the lawns of the Rashtrapati Bhavan, that's called today, what was the Viceregal Lodge, there was a tent in which some RAS men and officers stayed. And they did some work which was very hush-hush. No one knew what they were doing. What they were doing was passing top secret instructions from London to Mountbatten. And these were extraordinarily important secrets. And these were the only secrets the British wanted to keep secret. If they went out of their hands, the British were done for. And therefore they could not afford to lose that. So they used a method of encryption. And some of you might want to find out, who are the electrical communication engineers here? ECE. Who are computer science people here? You are. You might want to find out about encryption. Anybody can find out, there is nothing about this. Alan Matheson Turing was not an engineer, he was not a computer scientist. And he did all this, he originated it. And he used a method of encryption called the one-time patch system and to send these top secrets across. And what were these top secrets? The biggest secret was, he had built an electronic computer for the British war effort, and that computer had broken the German code called the Enigma.
Enigma code.
Enigma code. All the top secrets of the German military were being sent through the Enigma code. And these guys were sitting there with their computer and reading off the Enigma ciphers as if it was baby's play. And there was a special telephone circuit to Winston Churchill's place in 10 Downing Street. Very specially, carefully monitored telephone. Sometimes an urgent message would come and the people would pick up their phone and say, "Sir, we have a report." Tell it to, sometimes Churchill took the phone himself. And so all this went on. Anyway, to cut a long story short, there are other things about Alan and his own personal life. It was a time of great Victorian discipline when people had very strict moral codes and so on. And this man was a homosexual, unfortunately for him. And the British society treated him very, very badly. And he committed suicide finally. And all this, in a sense, to me it appeared, this happened a few kilometers from GCT. Maybe British blood flowed in his body, but I don't think, if he needed a bad transfusion, my blood would have worked in his body just as well. The differences between human beings is so small. And therefore, and he was after all conceived when the parents were in India, and his grandparents had lived here so long. They had done more for India than many Indians have done. So with all this, I wrote the story about the great man who was that close to GCT, yet not close enough, and who became such an important figure in history.